Today at 6, disgraced former news presenter Huw Edwards avoids jail for child sex abuse offences. He's given a suspended sentence. Edwards pleaded guilty earlier to charges of making 41 illegal images of children. He'll be on a sex offenders register for 7 years. The BBC says it's appalled by Edwards' crimes and that he's betrayed not just the BBC but audiences who trusted him. And our other top story tonight. Good evening. An image that will shock many people, that of the former BBC News presenter Huw Edwards in a custody photograph. He's been given a 6-month suspended prison sentence after admitting charges of making indecent images of children, one of whom was aged between 7 and 9. Edwards previously pleaded guilty to 3 charges after he was sent 41 illegal images by a convicted sex offender. His lawyer told the court that Edwards was profoundly sorry and that he recognised the repugnant nature of the images. The BBC said he'd betrayed not just the corporation but also audiences who put their trust in him. Our special correspondent Lucy Manning was in court.
Huw Edwards facing the camera. Not his usual one in the BBC studios, but the Metropolitan Police's after he was arrested. This, his custody photo. A far cry from his smart on-screen image.
Mr. Edwards, do you apologise? Mr. Edwards, do you apologise for your crimes?
Now a convicted sex offender, he came with a suitcase, prepared if his punishment was prison. The court heard disturbing and graphic details of his crimes, descriptions of the videos of children, including one as young as 7 that he looked at, and money he gave to another sex offender who sent them to him. The images were discovered in the WhatsApp messages of Alex Williams, who sent them to Edwards. The police were unable to find the former newsreader's phone that he'd used to look at them. Edwards' responses to the 41 indecent images are particularly revealing. In one exchange, he describes the images Williams has sent as amazing. Williams then says he can try and get more videos. If you like, 13, 14, 15, 16. Months later, Edwards says, don't send underage. But in another exchange, when Williams describes images he's offering as young, Edwards replies, go on. As the judge sentenced him, he listened intensely, emotional as the court heard about his mental health problems, his suicide risk, and an upbringing where his failure to get into Oxford left him feeling like an outsider at the BBC.
Edwards, through his barrister, apologised. He said he wanted the court to know how profoundly sorry he was, that the images were repugnant and he recognised the hurt done to those in them, that he had betrayed the trust and faith of so many people and hurt and damaged his family.
But the police clear that when Edwards looked at the pictures and videos, exploited children were the victims here.
Behind every image is a vulnerable child that has been violated, that has been subject to abuse, and the continuing sort of distribution of those images only goes to service that demand.
Tonight at 10, thousands of police
Edwards was at the top of his career and the BBC, the man entrusted to tell the nation the Queen had died.
BBC Television is broadcasting this special programme reporting the death of Her Majesty the Queen.
Reading the news until he became it, initially suspended by the BBC last year in the aftermath of separate allegations in The Sun that he'd paid a young vulnerable man for explicit photos. The BBC, criticised for still paying him more than £200,000 after they knew he'd been arrested, said, "We are appalled by his crimes. He has betrayed not just the BBC, but audiences who put their trust in him."
It's very difficult to see any way that Huw can come back. I think you should never say never in this industry. He certainly would never be employed as you know, the flagship presenter for a major broadcaster. Even those close to him had one view of who Huw Edwards was, which is very different from the one that's been revealed in this process.
It is difficult to think of a more startling reversal of circumstances, from respected newsreader to convicted criminal. He'll now go on the sex offenders register.
As the judge said, his reputation is in tatters. Edwards breaking not just the trust viewers placed in him, but the law. Lucy Manning, BBC News.
Well, the conviction of Hugh Edwards has raised questions about sentencing and also about his former employer, the BBC. Our culture and media editor, Katie Razzle, is here with me. But first, let's talk to Dominic Casciani, our home and legal correspondent. Dom, can you explain the thinking behind his sentencing?
Yeah, I mean, the sentencing law, Rita, gives an enormous amount of discretion to judges and magistrates. And while on paper the maximum sentence is 10 years, in actual fact, the possession of images, and in this case, in the whole scheme of things, a relatively small number of images compared to other cases, meant the starting point was going to be much, much, much lower. In fact, in this case, about a year. That's completely standard. That then gets discounted by the Chief Magistrate for the early guilty plea, for the mitigation around Hugh Edwards' ill mental health. And then he has to take into account whether or not he poses an enduring danger to the public. Is there a risk there? And in this case, the Chief Magistrate concluded he could be safely managed in the community, so the necessity to send him to prison is removed, and therefore in that situation the logical place for the judge to end up on his calculation was a jail sentence but suspended for 2 years as a warning. But around that a very tight package of measures: sex offender treatment programme, sex offender register. He's a free man, but not really free in the whole scheme of things.
And Katie, just stepping back a bit, the BBC has called Hugh Edwards the villain of the piece, and no one would argue with that, but there are still questions for the BBC itself.
Well, yes, I mean, the man who regularly presented this programme is a convicted sex offender, and we must never forget that his actions had real victims, the children forced into those horrors who the judge said has experienced lifelong trauma. But there are still questions for the BBC. They've asked him to pay back around £200,000, paid to him after his arrest, before his resignation. There's no sign of that money, as far as I know. But why did they keep paying his salary? Well, a small group of leaders did know about his arrest. They were asked to keep it confidential by the police. They were balancing duty of care and contractual responsibilities to him as an employee with their wider reputational concerns. And in court today, we heard about his mental state and his suicide risk, and I'm sure that influenced their decision-making too. But they knew some of the indecent images were the most serious classification, Category A. They didn't know the children's ages, but many argue they should have taken more robust action. And then there's the question about how the corporation manages talent. Do the big beasts of broadcasting have too much power? They've announced a workplace review, an independent one, to look into that, and they will hope today they can draw a line after today on what's been a very bruising period.
Katie, Dominic, thank you both very much. And to watch the full story of the case, Hugh Edwards' Fall from Grace is available now on BBC iPlayer.